The wind howled across the Wyoming plains like a wounded beast, sweeping snow in blinding spirals that devoured the world whole. The land stretched endlessly and pale, an ocean of ice where even the sun seemed too weary to rise. Beneath its gray shroud trudged a lone wagon, creaking and groaning beneath the weight of its load and the stubborn will of the woman guiding it forward. Nora Bennett's fingers were stiff on the reins, her knuckles white beneath frayed gloves. Each breath burned her lungs. Each gust of wind clawed through her wool cloak. The horses had long since turned skittish, their hooves crunching uncertainly through snowdrifts that reached their chests. She whispered to them through cracked lips, gentle pleading words that the wind tore away before they reached the animals' ears. She had been a schoolteacher once, in a town that no longer existed for her. Back east, she'd left behind a grave marked by nothing but the initials of a man she'd loved and failed to save. The cold that had taken him had taken a part of her too. And now, crossing the plains alone, she carried both their ghosts like weights in her chest. The wagon wheels hit a rut, jerking the reins from her hands. She stumbled, gasping as the wagon tilted sharply to one side. A sharp crack rang through the storm, the axle snapping clean. The wagon slumped, half buried in a drift, and the mule nearest her let out a frightened bray, its leg trapped beneath the collapsed sideboard. Nora fell to her knees in the snow beside it, clawing with numb hands to free the animal. The cold bit through her sleeves, her breath coming in ragged clouds. She pulled, shoved, cursed, and prayed. The mule thrashed weakly, eyes rolling in panic. Snow thickened around them, turning sky and ground into a single white blur. She didn't notice how her body trembled, or how the edges of her vision dimmed with frost. Then, through the wailing wind, a shape moved on the horizon. At first, she thought it was another ghost. A figure on horseback, head bowed, scarf whipping like a banner in the gale. The horse fought against the wind as if climbing through water. The rider's coat was rimed with frost, his hat dusted white. He guided the animal close, eyes narrowed against the storm. "Ma'am," his voice cut through the wind, low and rough as gravel. "You'll freeze out here." "I can't leave him," Nora gasped, motioning to the trapped mule. The man dismounted, boots sinking deep into the snow. "Then we'll get him out together." His hands were steady, gloved, scarred, practiced. With a few heavy heaves, he wedged a broken plank beneath the wagon and lifted while she pulled. The mule gave a final desperate kick and wrenched free, stumbling upright. Nora collapsed back, panting. The man crouched beside her. His face was angular, wind-burnt, eyes the color of a winter sky. Distant but alive. "You shouldn't be alone out here. My place is an hour north. Storm's getting worse." Nora hesitated, pride warring with exhaustion. She didn't want charity. She didn't want to owe anyone anything. Not again. "I'll be fine," she said, though her voice trembled. He studied her for a moment, then removed his hat, brushing snow from its brim. "Name's Luke Carver," he said. "You won't last another mile, miss?" "Nora Bennett." "Well, Miss Bennett," he said quietly, "it's your choice. But if you stay, you'll die with the mules." The cold sliced through her resolve. She nodded once, unable to speak. Luke helped her onto his horse, securing her between his arms as he turned the animal into the wind. The wagon, the mules, her worldly possessions, all faded into the storm behind them. The horse plowed forward, snow swirling around them like ghosts chasing their trail. Nora leaned against his chest, too weak to resist, her breath shallow. Somewhere behind her eyelids the darkness began to settle, but through it she heard his voice, low and certain, carrying above the storm. "Hold on. I've got you." And for the first time in a long while, Nora didn't fight to stay standing. She simply let herself be carried into the storm. The world narrowed to firelight and the creak of timber. When Nora woke, the first thing she felt was warmth, a strange, almost foreign thing after days of biting cold. Her eyes fluttered open to a dim cabin, its corners wrapped in shadow. The air smelled of pine smoke and melted snow. A wool blanket lay heavy over her shoulders, and beside the hearth, the man from the storm sat in a rough-hewn chair, mending a torn saddle strap. Luke Carver glanced up, the lamplight catching in his eyes. "About time you woke," he said quietly. "You've been out for 2 days." Nora tried to sit up, but the room spun. Her voice rasped dry. "The mules?" "Alive, found 'em shelterin' by a bluff. They'll make it, thanks to you." He returned to his work, knife scraping against the leather. The fire popped between them, filling the silence. Her gaze roamed the small cabin, a single room of plain wood, every inch purposeful. A bed in the corner, a stove, a table built from rough pine. On the mantel sat an old photograph, its frame tarnished with age. She couldn't see the faces clearly, only 2 figures, a younger man and a boy standing beside him. Luke noticed her stare and rose, setting the strap aside. "Snow's still thick as thieves out there. You'll stay till it clears." "I can't impose," she said, clutching the blanket tighter. "I'll pay you once I reach town." He gave a short laugh, low, humorless. "Ain't about pay. It's about survival." The words hung in the air. He poured water from a kettle into a tin cup and handed it to her. His hands were rough, calloused, hands that knew work, loss, and silence. She took the cup, feeling the heat seep into her palms. "Where were you headed?" he asked. "Northwest," she said softly. "A small settlement near Red Creek. They need a schoolteacher. Red Creek's near 50 miles from here. Roads'll be buried for weeks." She stared into the cup, the reflection of firelight rippling across the surface. "Then I'll wait." Luke nodded once. No further questions. He moved to the window, prying open a shutter just enough to see the storm's edge, a wall of white pressing against the glass. That night, the wind screamed like a living thing. The roof shuddered and the fire fought to stay alive. Nora lay awake on a cot he'd built for her near the hearth, the sound of the storm clawing at her nerves. Across the room, Luke sat by the stove, feeding the flames piece by piece. At last she spoke. "You live here alone?" He didn't look up. "Been that way a while. Why?" He paused, poker still in his hand. "Some things don't leave you much choice." She wanted to ask more, to bridge the strange quiet between them, but the fatigue in her bones anchored her tongue. Days passed in a slow rhythm. The blizzard refused to ease. They melted snow in a pot for water, patched cracks in the walls where the wind slipped through. Luke chopped wood outside, his coat rimed with frost when he returned. Nora mended torn curtains, tended the fire, and swept the floor. Each act, however small, filled the silence between them. Sometimes she caught him watching her, never directly, but with a careful, sidelong glance, if seeing something he hadn't expected to find again. One evening, as they sat eating salted pork and stale bread, the lamp flickered low. She met his gaze across the table. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for finding me." He shook his head. "Wasn't your time to go?" Her lips curved, faint and tired. "Maybe not, but it might have been yours, coming after me in that storm." A muscle in his jaw tensed. "I've seen what happens when you don't go back for someone." The fire crackled, throwing restless shadows across the walls. Something unspoken passed between them then, something fragile, trembling like the light itself. Outside, the wind began to soften. Inside, for the first time, the silence felt less like loneliness and more like waiting. The storm lingered far longer than either expected. Days blurred into one another, marked only by the soft rhythm of chores and the howl of wind against the cabin walls. The snow lay thick and unmoving like a white ocean frozen mid-wave. The world outside seemed distant, unreachable, so they made do with the small world inside. Each morning Luke rose before dawn, his boots heavy on the wooden floorboards. He'd stoke the fire, chop wood, feed the mules, and return with the smell of cold clinging to him. Nora, wrapped in layers of wool, would prepare coffee from the last of his stores. Her hands steady, though her breath still trembled from the chill. Strong enough to wake the dead, he'd mutter each morning, taking a sip. "Then it's working," she'd answer, almost smiling. They fell into a rhythm, two people bound by necessity rather than choice, but slowly finding a strange comfort in the predictability of it. When the roof began to leak near the rafters, Nora climbed onto a chair to patch it with rags. Luke steadied her legs, grumbling, "You'll fall and break your neck before you fix that hole." "Then you'll have one less mouth to feed," she said, pressing cloth into the gap. He huffed, half amused, half annoyed, but his hand stayed near her ankle until she climbed down safely. The days were slow, but they worked, and as the storm continued to trap them, words became easier to share. One evening, while she sewed a tear in his coat, she asked quietly, "That photograph on your mantel, is that your family?" Luke paused, knife in hand. "My brother Will. What happened to him?" He didn't answer right away. The only sound was the wind brushing against the window pane. "We were caught in a storm like this one," he said finally. "Out mending fence. Thought we could beat the weather. I made it back." He didn't. Nora's hand froze on the fabric. "I'm sorry. Don't be. Sorry, it doesn't change much out here." Still, the weight in his voice lingered long after he turned away. Later that night, she found him outside, lantern light flickering across his face as he checked on the mules. Snow drifted down gently now, like feathers instead of knives. "You don't sleep much," she said from the doorway. He looked up. "Never been much good at it." She hesitated, arms folded around herself. "Neither have I." Luke smiled faintly, tired but genuine. "Then maybe we'll keep watch together." The next morning, sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time in weeks. It gleamed off the snow, blinding and pure. The sight drew a breathless laugh from Nora. She stepped outside, boots crunching through the crusted drifts. The air was sharp and clean, her cheeks flushed pink with the cold. Luke joined her, hat pulled low. "Almost forgot what color the sky was," he said. "It's bluer than I remember," she murmured. He glanced at her, something soft flickering in his gaze. "Storm makes you appreciate what's left when it clears." A week later, the snow began to melt enough for him to reach his cattle pens. He invited her to ride along, insisting the fresh air would do her good. Together they rode across the wide expanse, the horses kicking up powder as sunlight gleamed on distant peaks. They found a few calves half buried in snow and worked side by side to pull them free, their breath visible in the cold air. When one calf stumbled to its feet and tottered toward its mother, Nora laughed aloud, a sound bright enough to make Luke pause mid-step. He hadn't heard laughter in his home for years. It hit him like warmth after a long freeze. By the time they rode back to the cabin, the sky had turned gold with dusk. Inside, as she stirred stew over the fire, Luke caught himself humming an old tune his brother used to sing. She looked up, smiling. "Didn't take you for a man who hums. Didn't take you for a woman who laughs in a blizzard," he replied. They both chuckled. Then, the kind of laughter that came from relief, not humor. Outside, the snow no longer roared. It sighed. Inside, silence began to feel like peace. By midwinter, the valley had turned brittle and still. Snow blanketed the hills like glass, beautiful, treacherous, and merciless. Luke and Nora had fallen into a quiet rhythm of survival, each day stitched together by small acts of care. A shared meal, a mended shirt, a steady fire. But the peace was a fragile one, the kind that waits for the wind to shift. The storm had eased, but nature's dangers never slept long. It began one night when the cattle grew restless. Luke heard their low, uneasy bellows over the howl of the wind. He grabbed his rifle, pulling on his coat. Nora rose from the hearth, the lamplight flickering across her worried face. "What is it?" she asked. "Wolves," he said simply. "They'll come down hungry after a long storm." Without waiting for her protest, he pushed into the cold, boots crunching through the crusted snow. The air outside was sharp as a blade. The moon glowed faintly behind clouds, silvering the drifts. From the corral came another sound, the growl and yip of predators circling the herd. Nora hesitated only a heartbeat before snatching the lantern and following him. "Stay inside," he barked over his shoulder. "Not a chance," she shot back, gripping the lantern tight. When she reached the fence, the sight stole her breath, shadows darting low and fast across the snow, eyes glowing in the dim light. Luke fired once, the crack echoing through the valley. A wolf yelped and vanished into the dark, but others pressed closer, hunger driving them mad. One lunged at the fence, jaws snapping. The cattle screamed, trampling against the rails. Luke reloaded, his fingers stiff from the cold. Another wolf leapt, teeth flashing. He swung the rifle like a club, striking it down. But not before another shape burst from the shadows, knocking him into the snow. "Luke!" Nora cried, rushing forward. The lantern's light spilled across the chaos. Luke grappling with the wolf, its claws raking his arm. He shoved it back and fired again at point-blank range. Silence fell, broken only by his ragged breathing. Then he slumped forward, blood darkening the snow beneath him. Nora dropped to her knees beside him. "Luke! Luke!" His face was pale beneath the frost, eyes half-lidded. "I'm fine," he muttered through clenched teeth. "You're not fine," she snapped. "You're bleeding like the devil." With trembling hands, she tore a strip from her shawl and pressed it against the wound. He hissed in pain but didn't pull away. Together they stumbled back to the cabin, snow crunching beneath their boots, blood trailing behind them like a grim thread. Inside, she sat him down by the fire, lighting another lantern. The wound ran deep across his forearm, crimson against the pale of his skin. She cleaned it with trembling precision, her jaw set. "You shouldn't have come out," he said hoarsely. "You shouldn't have gone alone," she shot back. He tried to smile, but the pain broke through. "You always gotta have the last word, don't you?" "I had a husband once who never listened either," she whispered. Didn't end well for him. He fell quiet, watching her face. "What happened?" Nora's hands paused, the cloth soaked red. "Pneumonia," she said finally. "He was sick for days. I told him to rest, but he kept working the firewood. For me, I should have stopped him." "You think you caused it?" Luke said softly. She swallowed hard, tears brimming. "He died in my arms, Luke, because I didn't make him stay." For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire cracked and popped, filling the silence. Then Luke reached out, his blood-stained hand covering hers. "Listen to me," he said, voice low but fierce. "You didn't kill him. Sometimes the world just takes what it wants, no reason. No mercy." Her lip trembled, but she didn't look away. "I can't lose someone else," she whispered. He squeezed her hand, his eyes steady despite the pain. "You won't, not me. I'd die before I leave you." The words hung between them, raw and trembling as the storm outside howled anew. She looked at him then, not as a stranger or a savior, but as a man standing on the same edge she'd lived on for years. The firelight caught in her tears, in his half-smile, and for a moment the cold world outside ceased to exist. He leaned back, exhausted, and she rested her hand against his cheek. The silence between them wasn't empty now. It was full of everything they'd both tried not to feel. Outside, the wolves retreated. Inside, the fire burned on. The wolves never returned. But after that night, something unspoken shifted between them. Nora moved through the days with a quiet tenderness she hadn't known she was capable of anymore. When Luke's wound reopened, she scolded him gently and rewrapped it. When he managed to split wood one-handed, she laughed for the first time in months. Outside, the world began to thaw, just barely, the snow receding in thin, trembling sheets. Ice melted from the eaves, dripping in slow rhythm like the ticking of time itself. It was on one such morning that the sound of hooves approached from the distance. Luke stepped out onto the porch, hand resting on his rifle out of old habit. A lone rider emerged from the whiteness, a mail courier, dusted with frost, scarf drawn high. He dismounted stiffly, greeting Luke with a nod. "Brought a few letters down from the post in Riverview," the rider said, rummaging in his saddlebag. "One for you, Carver, and one for a Nora Bennett." Nora's name hung in the air like the crack of a whip. Luke froze. He turned toward the cabin door where she stood in the threshold, her shawl drawn tight. "For me?" she asked, voice small. The rider handed her a folded envelope, the paper wrinkled and faintly water-stained. "Came from back east," he said. "Looks important." Nora took it, her fingers trembling. "Thank you." When the rider left, she stood for a long while, staring down at the letter. The ink on the seal had smudged, but the handwriting was unmistakable, her late husband's lawyer. She stepped back inside, the firelight painting gold along the edges of the paper. Luke followed her in, hesitant. "Bad news?" She broke the seal with care. Her eyes scanned the lines, once, twice, and then she sank into a chair. The letter slipped from her hand onto the table. "It's about Daniel's estate," she murmured. "His family filed a claim. If I don't return east within the month, I lose everything he left me." Luke said nothing. He just stared at her, the color draining from his face. "What'll you do?" he asked quietly. I don't know." "You could stay," he said after a moment, though his voice faltered. "You've built something here." Nora met his gaze. "What I've built isn't mine, Luke. It's yours. Your land, your cattle, your life." He turned away, jaw tight. "You think I care about whose name's on the land?" "It's not about that," she said softly. "It's about duty. It's about letting go of what I ran from." The silence that followed was heavier than any storm. The wind outside picked up, rattling the shutters. "You'd go back?" he asked finally. "I have to," she whispered. "If I stay, I'll always wonder what I gave up. And if I go, you'll wonder what you left behind," he finished, voice rough. For the first time since the night of the wolves, she saw something break in him. Not anger, fear. The kind that comes from losing too much for too long. He busied himself with chores that day, saying little. When evening came, he sat by the cell, fire sharpening his knife, the rhythmic scrape of metal filling the room. Nora packed her things in silence. The shawl, her books, a few mementos from the journey west. At dawn, she stood by the door, coat buttoned, gloves pulled tight. "You've given me more kindness than I deserved," she said. "Thank you." Luke didn't look up from the fire. "Road's clear enough to make it to the valley by noon. There's a trader there who'll get you east." She lingered, waiting for him to say something, anything that might stop her. But he stayed silent. So she turned, stepping out into the thin morning light. Her footprints marked the snow, fading as the wind brushed them away. Only when she disappeared over the ridge did Luke finally look up. The fire had gone out. The cabin felt larger now, emptier. He rose, walked to the door, and stared into the whiteness beyond. The horizon stretched wide and cold. He told himself she'd made the right choice, that she deserved her old life back. But when the wind shifted and carried her name faintly through the air, he felt the truth settle deep as the roots of the pines. He'd let her go because he was too afraid to ask her to stay. Snow returned to the plains like a ghost reluctant to leave. Luke had watched it come from the ridge, his breath a mist against the dawn. Days had passed since Nora's departure. How many? He didn't count. The cabin, once warmed by her laughter and quiet chatter, now echoed with its absence. He'd tried to fill it with work, repairing fences, tending the herd, patching the roof, but every creak and whisper reminded him of her voice. He told himself she was safe by now, riding east toward her old life. Told himself that letting her go was mercy. But in the cold hours before dawn, when the fire burned low, mercy felt an awful lot like cowardice. The storm had begun suddenly and fiercely, a white curtain sweeping over the plains with the same fury as the one that had brought her to him. He was mending the barn door when the wind shifted, carrying a faint, desperate sound across the valley. A shout, no, a cry. He froze. Then he heard it again. Without hesitation, Luke saddled his horse and rode out into the blizzard. Snow lashed, his face the wind tearing at his coat, but he pressed forward, guided by instinct more than sight. The world had turned to white chaos, the land and sky indistinguishable. And then, through the storm, he saw movement. A wagon half buried in snow, horses tangled in their harnesses, and beside them, a figure crouched against the wind, trying to shield another. Nora! The sound tore from him before he even believed it. She looked up, eyes wide with shock and relief. Luke! She shouted back, her voice nearly swallowed by the wind. He dismounted and stumbled toward her, grabbing her shoulders. What in God's name? We were trying to make it through the pass, she gasped. The storm hit faster than we thought. The driver, he's hurt. Luke followed her gaze. A man lay slumped near the wagon, blood staining the snow around his leg. Two others huddled beside him, travelers pale and frightened. Without another word, Luke helped haul the injured man onto his horse, then turned to Nora. Take the reins, he ordered. We're getting everyone back to the cabin. She didn't argue. She climbed up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist as the horse plunged through the storm. The ride back was brutal. Snow blinded them, wind cutting deep. Twice the horse nearly stumbled, and both times Luke felt her grip tighten, heard her whisper, "Don't you dare stop." When they finally reached the cabin, the door burst open to light and warmth. Luke guided the horse into the barn, then returned to help the others inside. They built a fire fast, the room filling with heat and the smell of wet wool. Nora knelt beside the injured man, pressing cloth against his wound, her hands steady despite the tremor in her jaw. You haven't changed, Luke murmured. She glanced up, eyes bright in the firelight. Neither have you. For a long moment they just looked at each other. The storm raging outside, the silence between them louder than the wind. Word spread fast once the weather cleared. The mail rider had told the townsfolk of Luke's rescue, of how he'd ridden into a blizzard for strangers, and for a woman. When the travelers reached town alive, folks began to speak his name differently. The recluse from the Carver place wasn't just a ghost of old grief anymore. He was a man who'd saved lives. Luke didn't care much for talk, but when he rode into town a week later for supplies, he felt the difference in every nod, every tip of the hat. The blacksmith clapped him on the shoulder. The storekeeper gave him an extra sack of flour for the lady. He rode home through thawing snow, heart heavy and full all at once. Nora met him at the fence, her hair loose beneath her hood, eyes soft with something he'd almost forgotten how to recognize. Hope. "Didn't think you'd come back to this place," he said, dismounting. "I tried leaving once," she said quietly. "Didn't much care for how it felt." He smiled, just barely, the kind of smile that lived deeper than words. "Storms keep finding you, Miss Bennett." "Maybe because I keep finding my way back to them," she said. "Or to you." For the first time in years, Luke laughed, a sound warm enough to melt the last of the snow. Behind them, the sun broke through the clouds, turning the white valley gold. And in that moment, he realized the truth he'd been too. Afraid to name home wasn't the cabin, the land, or even the safety he'd built. It was the heart that kept walking back through the storm. Spring crept in slowly, like a secret the land wasn't sure it wanted to tell. The snow pulled back from the hills, revealing grass the color of faded gold. The creek began to sing again, running free beneath the thaw. For the first time in months, the air smelled of earth instead of ice. Nora and Luke worked side by side from dawn until dusk, rebuilding the damage winter had left behind. The barn roof needed patching, fences mending, and the herd counting. There was comfort in the rhythm of it all, the way their movements fit together like the lines of a familiar song. Luke fixed the corral gate while Nora hauled boards from the shed. When he caught her struggling with a plank twice her size, he shook his head and crossed over. "You planning on building a fence or wrestling one?" he teased. She grinned, a smear of dirt on her cheek. "You talk too much for a man who claims to like quiet." "Maybe I found better things to listen to," he said, his voice low. The words lingered between them, unhurried, easy. The days stretched longer now, golden light spilling across the valley in broad, forgiving strokes. Each evening they sat on the porch with coffee in hand, watching the horizon fade to violet. It was one such evening that Nora finally said it. "I didn't think I'd stay," she murmured. "When I left here, I told myself it was the right thing. That duty mattered more than peace. But out there, Luke, everything felt empty, like the world had gone quiet again." He nodded slowly, eyes on the distant line of the mountains. "You came back anyway." "I came back because you went after me," she said. "Because no one ever did that before." Luke turned to her then, really seeing her, the lines of resolve softened by the light, the steadiness in her gaze. "I almost didn't," he admitted. "I was scared you'd already made up your mind. Scared I'd lose you before I even tried." She smiled faintly. "You did lose me, but only for a while." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was full, humming with all the words that didn't need to be said. He reached out, covering her hand with his, thumb tracing small circles across her skin. "No more running from the cold," he said quietly. Her eyes glistened. "No more running." When he leaned in, the kiss was unhurried, gentle as spring rain, honest as the thaw. Outside, the wind moved through the pines like a sigh of relief. That night, they worked together to rebuild the last of the broken fencing along the ridge. Nora hammered the nails while Luke held the board steady. The rhythm of their labor, hammer, breath, pause, became its own kind of vow. By the time they finished, the valley was dark, stars stitched across the sky. They stood there a long while, watching the herd settle. The world hushed except for the low murmur of cattle and the whisper of grass. Luke broke the silence first. "Never thought I'd see this place come back to life." Nora smiled up at him. "It's not just the land that's come back." He looked at her, the corners of his mouth lifting. "You sure you want to stay out here? Not much company besides me and the cows." "I've had worse company," she teased. "Besides, I figure someone's got to make sure you eat more than coffee and stubbornness." He laughed then, a deep, quiet laugh that carried into the night. When they walked back to the cabin, hand in hand, the door creaked open to the scent of wood smoke and stew. It wasn't fancy, but it was home. Inside, the firelight caught their faces, two people marked by loss but no longer ruled by it. Luke poured her a cup of coffee, the same way he had on that first morning she woke in his cabin, but this time his hand lingered as he passed it to her. "To the end of winter," he said. She raised her cup. "And to whatever comes after." Outside, the last patches of snow melted beneath the rising moon. Inside, warmth settled deep into the walls. The blizzards had come and gone. The ghosts had quieted. And in their place, something steady and bright had taken root. Love, born not from chance but from endurance. By the time spring fully took hold, the valley had transformed. The snow that once buried the plains now fed the streams, turning the fields a deep, lush green. Wildflowers dotted the slopes like sparks of color against the waking earth. The mountains stood blue and clear in the distance, their crowns still kissed with white. But the cold had loosened its grip at last. Nora walked the path that led from the cabin to the hill overlooking the pasture. In her hands, she carried a stack of books bound with twine, their pages worn and precious. The wind tugged at her hair, carrying the scent of pine and fresh water. Below her, Luke was mending a fence post, sleeves rolled up, sunlight glinting off the curve of his shoulders. He glanced up as she passed, offering a faint grin. "Headed to the new schoolhouse?" he asked, wiping sweat from his brow. She nodded, smiling. "First lesson today." Luke's gaze lingered on her, soft with quiet pride. "You built that yourself?" "With some help from the carpenter in town," she said, teasing. "And a few extra nails from your barn, if I recall." He chuckled. "Guess I can charge you tuition then." "Careful," she said with a mock glare. "I'll make you sit in the front row." He laughed outright this time, a sound as easy as the morning breeze. It was still strange to hear it, to feel laughter echo where silence once lived. Strange and good. She continued up the hill where the new schoolhouse stood, a small, sturdy building of pine logs and stone. Its windows gleamed in the sun, curtains fluttering in the open air. Around it, children from nearby homesteads played in the grass, their laughter carrying across the valley. When Nora stepped through the doorway, the sound of tiny boots and whispers filled the room. She set her books on the desk and looked around. Bare walls, clean floors, the smell of fresh wood and chalk. It was simple, humble, and perfect. As she wrote her name on the slate board, Mrs. Nora Bennett Carver, a smile touched her lips. The chalk trembled just slightly in her hand. She hadn't planned on the new name. It had just fit, the way things sometimes do when the heart catches up to what the soul already knows. Outside through the window, she saw Luke leading a stray colt back toward the pasture. The animal, all legs and nervous energy, tugged against the rope before finally following. He spoke to it softly, patient and firm, and the colt began to calm. Nora watched him for a long moment, her chest warm with something deep and quiet. Not the dizzy kind of love she'd known in her youth, but something steadier, earned, rooted in hardship and healing. When the lessons ended that afternoon, she stepped outside to find him waiting by the fence. "How'd they behave?" he asked, tilting his hat back. "As well as any group of wild colts," she said. "But they'll learn," he smiled. "That's what you said about me, did I?" she asked with a raised brow. More than once. She reached for his hand then, calloused fingers warm against hers. Together they walked down the hill, sunlight spilling over them like a benediction. The valley stretched before them, green pastures, running water, the faint shimmer of distant heat on the plains. A hawk wheeled above, free and unhurried. Near the barn, the colt Luke had tamed broke into a run, its hooves drumming softly against the earth. Nora laughed, the sound bright and full, and Luke turned to watch her. The wind lifted her hair, sunlight catching the gold strands. For a moment, she looked like the first day of spring come to life. He leaned on the fence post, eyes crinkling. "Never thought I'd see this land bloom again," he said quietly. "You just needed someone to remind you what spring looks like," she replied. He slipped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. "And you needed someone to pull you out of the snow." They stood there a long time, neither speaking. The world had grown still again, but not the stillness of loneliness. It was peace, the kind that comes after the storm, when everything broken has found a way to mend. As the sun dipped low, painting the valley in honey and amber, Nora turned toward the cabin. Smoke rose from its chimney in thin curls, soft and familiar. She took one last look at the schoolhouse on the hill, at the colt racing free, at the man beside her who had once been as lost as she was, and whispered, almost to herself, "Home." Luke smiled, eyes on the horizon. "Yeah," he said. "We finally made it." The wind moved through the grass, carrying the scent of pine and promise. The valley, reborn, breathed deep, and the story that began in snow ended in sunlight. If you enjoyed this tale from the Wild West, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of courage, love, and redemption under the open sky. Until next time, keep your saddle ready and your heart steady.